The obsidian rotunda of the Ethelgard Dominion did not merely occupy space. It dominated it, a vast, hollowed-out sphere suspended within the gravitational null zone of a binary star system. The architecture itself a testament to a civilization that had forgotten the concept of humility eons ago. Inside the council chamber, the air was recycled but tasted of ozone and ancient stone, filtered through scrubbers that had been humming since the Ethelgard first cracked the shell of their homeworld and reached for the throat of the galaxy. High Exarch Vox stood upon the central dais, his multifaceted eyes reflecting the holographic projection of the Milky Way that hovered above the assembly, a shimmering swirl of light where every conquered system was marked in the violent crimson of the Dominion. He was a creature of chitin and silk, draped in the ceremonial robes of the warcaste, his mandibles clicking in a rhythm that signified both agitation and supreme confidence. The atmosphere was thick, heavy with the gravity of the decision at hand, a silence that was not empty but pressurized, like the hull of a submarine diving too deep. The assembled counselors, representing the thousands of subjugated worlds and vassal species that bowed to the Ethelgard, watched him with a mixture of terrified reverence and calculating ambition. They were debating the Sol system. They were debating the extinction of a species that had barely learned to leave its own gravity well, or so the Dominion intelligence networks claimed. "The humans are a variable we can no longer tolerate," Vox's voice boomed, amplified by the acoustics of the rotunda so that it rattled the sensory spines of every being present, a deep, resonant sound that felt more like a physical impact than an auditory one. "They occupy a strategic junction, a resource-rich gravity well that sits astride the hyperlanes we require for the expansion into the outer rim. They are small. They are fractured." They shout into the void with radio waves and primitive lasers, begging for attention, unaware that in the dark forest of this galaxy, making noise is a death sentence. "We shall answer their call. We shall answer it with the full might of the Third Conquest Armada. It will not be a war. It will be a correction, a localized erasure." He gestured with a clawed hand, and the hologram zoomed in on the Sol system, a tiny, insignificant speck of yellow-white light orbited by rocky debris and gas giants. It looked fragile, it looked unprotected, it looked like prey. Observer Thyra, seated in the lower tiers of the science division, shifted her weight uncomfortably, her internal fluid sacs pulsing with anxiety. Unlike Vox, she did not see a conquest. She saw an anomaly. For cycles, her deep-range sensors had been monitoring the human sphere, and the data simply did not make sense. Civilizations that were fractured and noisy emitted a specific pattern of chaotic radiation. Wars, encrypted communications, leaked energy signatures. But Earth had gone quiet, not the silence of extinction, but the silence of a held breath. The chaotic radio waves of their early history had vanished decades ago, replaced by a low, rhythmic thrum that defied standard analysis. It wasn't emptiness, it was efficiency. "High Exarch," Thyra spoke, her voice trembling slightly as she activated her podium, the light washing over her pale, chitinous features. "If I may interject, the data from the Sol sector suggests irregularities. The energy signatures we are detecting are not consistent with a primitive civilization. They are consistent with a civilization that is masking its output. We see no fleet movements, yet the gravimetric readings around their outer planets fluctuate wildly. It is as if something massive is moving there, yet remains invisible to our optical and thermal scans. I advise caution. I advise a scout element before the main fleet is committed." Vox turned his gaze upon her, and the weight of his contempt was palpable, heavy enough to crush a lesser will. "Caution," he spat, the word dripping with disdain. "The Ethelgard do not scout, we do not creep in the shadows like scavengers. We are the apex. We arrive, we announce our presence with the fire of 1,000 suns, and we take what is ours. You see shadows and call them monsters, observer. I see empty space waiting to be filled with our glory. The humans are hiding because they are afraid. They have seen our expansion. They know we are coming. Their silence is not a tactic, it is the paralysis of terror. Do not mistake cowardice for capability." A ripple of murmuring approval went through the warcaste counselors, sycophants who fed on Vox aggression. Thyra lowered her head, but her mind was racing, her intuition screaming that the predator was walking into a trap, that the silence of the humans was not fear but focus. The decision was made, the order was given. The vast machinery of the Dominion began to turn, a grinding of gears that spanned light years. The launch of the Third Conquest Armada was not merely a military maneuver. It was a religious spectacle, a demonstration of industrial might intended to cow the galaxy into submission. From the orbital shipyards of Ethelgard Prime, the vessels detached from their moorings like a swarm of angry hornets leaving a hive. These were not small ships. The dreadnoughts alone were the size of cities, bristling with kinetic railguns, plasma lances, and planet-cracking bombardment cannons. The cruisers that flanked them were sleek, predatory shapes designed for atmospheric dominance. There were no numbers to count them, for to count them was to diminish their scale. They were a tide of alloy and energy, a river of steel flowing into the dark ocean of the void. As they aligned their vectors for the jump to Sol, the fabric of spacetime around the homeworld groaned under the stress of thousands of warp drives spooling up simultaneously. The light of the local star dimmed as the fleet drew power from the Dyson arrays, a vampire-like drain that signaled the beginning of the end for whoever stood in their path. On the bridge of the flagship Sovereign's Will, Fleetmaster Kale merely watched the readouts with bored detachment. He had burned a dozen worlds. He had erased species whose history spanned millennia. Humanity was just another footnote, another primitive culture to be filed under extinct in the Dominion archives. "Jump coordinates locked," the navigation officer reported, his voice devoid of emotion. "Target, Sol system, high orbit over the third planet. Transit time, 3 standard cycles." Kale nodded. "Engage." The universe twisted. The stars elongated into streaks of infinite light. The Armada vanished from the Ethelgard system, punching a hole through the sublayer of reality, riding the currents of hyperspace toward an enemy that, in their minds, was already dead. Back in the rotunda, the holographic display shifted to show the fleet's progress, a burning arrow of red light moving inexorably toward the tiny yellow dot of Sol. Vok watched with satisfaction. "Let the galaxy watch," he announced to the chamber. "Let them see what happens to those who refuse to bow. When the humans are dust, we shall build a monument on their moon, a testament to the inevitability of the Dominion." But Thyra was not watching the fleet. She was watching the Sol system. And as the red arrow drew closer, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The yellow dot of the human sun, it blinked. Just once. A microscopic fluctuation in its luminosity, synchronized perfectly with the entry vector of the Armada. It wasn't a natural phenomenon, it was a signal. The journey through hyperspace was usually a time of maintenance and rest for the crew, but on the Sovereign's Will, a creeping unease began to spread through the ranks. It started with the sensor officers. Deep within the subspace currents, they were detecting echoes. Not the random noise of the universe, but structured pulses. Music. It was classical human music, complex and mathematical, looping on frequencies that should have been empty. It was faint, ghostly, bleeding through the shielding of the warp drives. Then came the anomalies in the navigation computers. Vectors would shift by microdegrees without input. The estimated time of arrival fluctuated, jumping forward and backward as if space itself was becoming elastic. Kale dismissed it as interference from the sheer mass of the fleet disrupting the hyperspace corridor, but his engineers were less certain. "It feels artificial," one engineer whispered to another in the bowels of the engine room. "Like the road we are driving on is being paved as we move." When the fleet finally reverted to real space, they did not arrive in the chaotic, debris-filled orbit of Earth as they expected. They arrived in a kill box. The transition from hyperspace was usually violent, a sudden deceleration that strained the inertial dampeners, but this time it was seamlessly smooth, terrifyingly so. The stars stopped streaking and settled into hard points of light instantly. The fleet hung in the void, weapons charged, shields at maximum, ready to rain fire upon the human world. But as the optical sensors cleared and the tactical displays refreshed, a collective gasp of confusion swept through the bridge of the Sovereign's Will. They were not over Earth. They were not even in the inner system. They had been pulled out of warp early, halted at the very edge of the heliosphere, beyond the orbit of the uttermost gas giant. And they were not alone. Facing them, filling the visual range of the fleet, was not a human armada. There were no jagged warships, no missile platforms, no swarms of fighters. There was only a construct. A lattice. It was a web of spun light and silver metal, a megastructure so fine and intricate it looked like lace draped across the cosmos, yet so massive it dwarfed the Dominion fleet entirely. It stretched across the darkness, catching the distant light of the sun and refracting it into a spectrum of impossible colors. It was beautiful, it was silent, and it was blocking their path. "Report," Kale barked, his calm facade cracking. "What is that structure? Why are we halted?" The sensor officer's hands flew across his console, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Fleetmaster, our drives, they are offline, not damaged, just inactive. The physics of the warp field have collapsed locally. We cannot move forward, we cannot retreat. And that structure, it registers as a single continuous energy field. It's a net, a containment field." "Hail them," Kale ordered, his mandibles twitching. "Tell them they are interfering with the Ethelgard Dominion. Tell them to stand down or be destroyed." The communications officer opened a channel, broadcasting on all frequencies, shouting the Dominion's might into the void. But there was no answer, only the hum of the lattice. For hours, the fleet sat there, impotent, drifting against the backdrop of the stars. The weapons officers reported that their targeting computers were failing to lock. Every time they tried to focus on the lattice, the systems would reset, looping through diagnostic cycles. It wasn't electronic warfare. It was as if the computers simply couldn't comprehend the geometry of the thing in front of them. Tension on the ships turned to panic. The crews, bred for war and conquest, did not know how to handle an enemy that refused to fight, an enemy that simply stopped them with a wall of light. Then the lattice moved. It didn't break, it didn't fire, it simply rippled like a curtain in a breeze. And from the center of the web, a single vessel emerged. It was small, stark white, smooth as a pearl, with no visible engines or weapons. It glided toward the massive dreadnought Sovereign S will with a casual, devastating grace. It stopped just off the bow, a flea staring down a dragon. A communication channel opened, overriding the Dominion's encryption with effortless ease. The bridge speakers crackled, and a voice filled the room. It was not a computer. It was a man. His voice was calm, weary, and sounded like a professor disappointed in a student who had failed a simple test. "This is High Admiral Vance of the Terran Union Defense Grid. You have entered a restricted ecological preservation zone. Your propulsion systems have been dampened to prevent contamination of local spacetime. Please state your intent." Kale stared at the speaker, his rage boiling over. "Intent? We are the Ethelgard Dominion. We are here to claim this system. We are here to burn your worlds and enslave your people. Release our drives immediately or face the wrath of—" The human cut him off. Not with anger, but with a sigh. "The Ethelgard? Yes, we've been watching your expansion for 300 years. We saw you burn the Kyrian Traverse. We saw what you did to the moons of Vex. We had hoped that by the time you reached us, you might have matured. It appears we were optimistic." The human paused, and the silence that followed was heavier than the void outside. "You have brought a fleet of kinetic weapons and fusion bombs to a system that mastered zero-point energy extraction before you invented the wheel. You are not an invasion force, Fleetmaster. You are a fire hazard, and we do not allow fires in the library." Back in the rotunda, the live feed from the fleet was being watched in horrified silence. Vox stood frozen, his claws gripping the podium until the stone cracked. The arrogance was draining out of the room, replaced by a cold, creeping realization. The humans weren't underestimated. They were unknown. They were outside the context of the Dominion's understanding of power. Thyra watched the data streams, her scientific curiosity overriding her fear. She saw what the fleet could not. The lattice wasn't just a wall. It was a transmutation field. The energy readings from the Dominion ships were dropping, not because they were being drained, but because the potential energy within their fuel cells was being rewritten. The humans were altering the physical constants of the space around the fleet. They were turning the uranium in the warheads into lead. They were turning the plasma in the conduits into inert gas. They were disarming the fleet by editing reality. "Fire!" Kale screamed on the bridge of the flagship. "Fire everything! Burn that white ship to ash!" The weapons officers slammed their firing studs. The massive railguns of the dreadnoughts, capable of accelerating slugs to a fraction of light speed, thrummed with power. The magnetic rails engaged, the capacitors discharged, and nothing happened. The slugs slid out of the barrels at a walking pace, tumbling harmlessly into the void. The plasma lances sputtered and died like wet matches. The missiles remained in their tubes, their chemical propellants refusing to ignite. The laws of physics inside the containment field had been tweaked just enough to make high-velocity violence impossible. The crew of the Sovereigns will looked at their hands, at their consoles, in sheer terror. They were trapped in a bubble of pacifism enforced by godlike technology. "You have neutralized your kinetic capabilities," Vance's voice returned, still calm, still polite. "We have also locked your navigational computers. Your fleet is now under the custody of the Terran Union. We will not destroy you. That would be wasteful. You have thousands of ships, millions of crew. Biological distinctiveness is valuable. You will be processed. Your weapons will be recycled. Your ships will be repurposed for colonization efforts in the outer sectors. You are no longer conquerors. You are now refugees." The enormity of the statement hit the Dominion hierarchy like a physical blow. The fleet was not being fought. It was being confiscated. It was being treated like a child's toy that had been taken away because the child played too roughly. Vok roared in the rotunda, a sound of pure denial. "Impossible, sorcery, tricks. They cannot simply turn off our weapons, reinforcements, send the Second Fleet, send the Reserve Guard." But the counselors were not looking at him. They were looking at the screens where the white ship was now projecting a beam of light onto the flagship. It wasn't a laser. It was a scanner. A deep-tissue molecular scanner that was reading the biology of every crew member, the composition of every bolt. The humans were cataloging them. "Hi, Exarch," Thyra said, her voice cutting through Vox's rant. "There is no second fleet to send. Look at the long-range sensors." She gestured to the main display. The map of the Dominion, once a sea of red, was changing. Along the borders, human ships, silver, sleek, silent, were decloaking. They had been there all along, in every system, orbiting every major world. They had been watching, waiting, hidden in the folds of space-time, waiting for the Dominion to break the one rule humanity had set. Do not touch the Sol system. "They are everywhere," Thyra whispered. "They could have destroyed us 1,000 years ago. Why didn't they?" The answer came not from the council, but from the human ambassador who suddenly materialized in the center of the rotunda. There was no flash of teleportation, no sound of transport beams. One moment the space was empty, the next a human stood there. He was older than Vance, dressed in simple gray robes, holding a datapad. Looked around the massive, intimidating chamber with the air of a tourist visiting a museum. "We didn't destroy you," the human said, addressing the stunned assembly, "because we needed to see if you could change. Evolution is a painful process. We prefer not to interrupt it unless necessary." He looked up at Vok, who was trembling with rage and fear. "I am Ambassador Solas. I'm here to accept your unconditional surrender. Not of your empire. Keep your titles, keep your palaces if they comfort. But your military is dissolved. Your expansion is over. Your fleets are now ours." Vok drew his ceremonial blade, a jagged shard of crystal that hummed with energy. "You enter my hall, you mock my people, you steal my ships. I will carve the flesh from your bones." He leaped from the dais, covering the distance to the human in a single, powerful bound, the blade descending in a lethal arc. The counselors flinched. Thyra screamed. The blade struck and shattered. It didn't hit a shield, it hit the human's raised hand. Solas had caught the energy blade with his bare palm, the skin not even scorched. He held the shattered remnants of the weapon, looking at Vok with pity. "Kinetic dampening fields," Solas explained gently. "Personalized. We mastered them during the Silicon Wars. Violence is so inefficient, Exarch." He pushed Vok back, a gentle shove that sent the massive alien sprawling onto the stone floor. The symbolism was absolute. The strongest warrior of the Ethelgard had been disarmed and dismissed by a human who hadn't even raised his voice. The battle for Sol, if it could be called that, was over in less than an hour. The Third Conquest Armada was systematically boarded by drone swarms that welded airlocks shut and pumped sleep gas into the ventilation systems. The ships were towed away to the Uit Cloud shipyards for disassembly. On Ethelgard Prime, the realization of total defeat washed over the population. There was no invasion. No bombs fell. The sky didn't burn. Instead, the global communication networks were hijacked. Screens on every street corner and every home displayed a message from the Terran Union. It wasn't a declaration of martial law. It was an educational primer. It showed the history of the Ethelgard not as the glorious conquerors they believed themselves to be, but as a danger to galactic stability. It showed the worlds they had burned, the species they had erased. And then it showed what humanity could do. It showed terraforming projects that turned dead worlds green in days. It showed medical technology that cured the genetic rot plaguing the Ethelgard royalty. It showed a path forward that didn't involve war. Act 2 had begun not with a bang, but with a cultural overhaul. The humans didn't occupy the cities, they occupied the minds. They flooded the Dominion with art, with philosophy, with history. They sent teachers, doctors, and engineers. They treated the Ethelgard not as enemies, but as a disaster relief project. This was the ultimate insult to Vok, who languished in house arrest in his own palace, forced to watch as his people embraced the conquerors who brought food instead of fire. Thyra, however, found herself thriving. She was elevated to the position of liaison, working directly with Solas. Through her interactions with the humans, she began to peel back the layers of their civilization. She learned that the silence of Earth was deliberate. The humans had built a shell around their system, a Dyson swarm of stealth satellites that absorbed all outgoing radiation. They lived in a paradise of their own making, terrified that if they made noise, they would attract something. But not the Ethel. The Ethelgard were too small to be the reason for such paranoia. "Why?" Thyra asked Solas one evening as they walked through the hydroponic gardens of the repurposed Ethelgard flagship. The ship was now a mobile university traveling between the vassal worlds. "You possess power that rivals the stars themselves. You can rewrite physics. You can disarm armadas with a thought. Why hide? Why let us posture and threaten you for centuries? You could have ruled the galaxy." Solas stopped and looked at a flowering vine, a species from Earth that was being adapted to the alien atmosphere. His face grew somber, the mask of polite diplomacy slipping to reveal a deep, ancient weariness. We do not hide from you, Thyra. We hide from what is watching the galaxy from the outside. We hide from the great filter. Thyra felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air recyclers. The great filter? A theory? A myth? Solas shook his head. A reality. Our archaeologists found the ruins of the precursors 2,000 years ago. They didn't die out. They were harvested. There is a cycle, Thyra. Every 50,000 years, when the galactic civilizations reach a certain threshold of energy output, they come. The harvesters, they track the noise. They track the warp signatures. They track the empires that shout, I am here. Into the dark. He turned to her, his eyes intense. That is why we silenced Earth. That is why we dampened our drives. We were trying to stay beneath the noise floor. But the Ethel Guard, you were shouting. You were lighting signal fires all over this sector. Your expansion, your wars, your unshielded warp usage. You were going to ring the dinner bell. We didn't stop you to save ourselves from you. We stopped you to save all of us from them. The revelation struck Thyra with the force of a physical blow. The Ethel Guard's pride, their glorious conquest, their obsession with visible power, it was all a suicide note. They had been unknowingly beaconing a cosmic predator. The humans weren't the enemy, they were the frantic parents trying to silence a crying baby before the wolves heard. So the erasure of our fleet, she stammered. It was to lower the signal? Precisely, Solas nodded. We had to lower the entropic volume of this sector immediately. We couldn't ask you to stop, you wouldn't have listened. We had to take the toys away. But we are running out of time. The signal has already gone out. The echo of your wars is traveling through the void. They might already be on their way. This was the turning point. The realization that the local political struggles were meaningless dust in the face of a true existential threat. The story shifted from a tale of human dominance to a tale of desperate unification. Act 3 began with the Ethel Guard Council, now led by Thera after Vox's forced abdication due to irreconcilable cognitive dissonance, formally dissolving the Dominion and reforming as the Ethel Guard Compact, a junior member of the Terran Alliance. The humans opened their archives. They shared the designs for the silent drives, engines that moved without rippling the fabric of space. They shared the kinetic dampeners. They transformed the Ethel Guard manufacturing base from a war machine into a defense machine. But it was not just technology, it was philosophy. The Ethel Guard had to learn to be quiet. They had to learn the value of the void. The grand speeches in the rotunda were replaced by hushed strategic meetings. The gold and crimson of the fleets were repainted in matte black, coated in radar-absorbent metamaterials. The galaxy, once noisy with the boastful transmissions of the Dominion, began to go dark. System by system, the lights went out. Not because life had ended, but because life had learned to hide. The humans orchestrated a galactic blackout, a desperate attempt to camouflage the entire arm of the Milky Way before the harvesters arrived. And then the sensors picked it up. Not a fleet, not a signal, a shadow. At the very edge of the galaxy, where the stars thinned out into the intergalactic void, a star vanished. Then another. Then a whole cluster. It wasn't a natural eclipse. Something was moving in front of the stars, something so massive it blotted out the light of entire systems. The harvesters had arrived. The high synod chamber was different now. The layout was the same, but the atmosphere had shifted from arrogant aggression to cold, hard calculation. Humans and Ethel Guard stood side by side, looking at the holographic map. The red stain of the Dominion was gone, replaced by the blue markers of the Alliance defense grid. Solas stood at the center, flanked by Thyra. "They are here," Solas said softly. "The silence beyond the rim. They have found the breadcrumbs you left." Thyra looked at the terrifying void eating the stars on the map. She should have been paralyzed with fear, but looking at the humans, she felt a strange surge of hope. They weren't panicking. They weren't despairing. They were working. "Deployment strategy Alpha 9, Solas commanded. "Activate the resonance traps in the outer sectors. If they want energy, let's feed them." The plan was insane. The humans had rigged the dead systems on the rim, systems the Ethel Guard had scorched centuries ago with antimatter charges the size of moons. They were going to turn the edge of the galaxy into a minefield. "We cannot defeat them in a straight fight," Solas admitted to the assembly. "They are ancient. They are endless. But we don't have to kill them. We just have to make this galaxy too painful to eat. We have to be the bone that chokes the wolf." The climax wasn't a battle of fleets exchanging fire. It was a battle of wits and traps. The massive shadow entities entered the trap zone. The Alliance waited. The tension in the chamber was agonizing. Hours stretched into days. The Ethel Guard crews manning the silent black ships alongside human officers held their breath. They watched as the darkness engulfed the first trapped system. "Wait for it," Solas whispered. "Wait for the digestion cycle." The sensors showed the energy output of the star dropping as the entity began to feed. Now. A button was pressed. A signal, tight beam, and encrypted shot out. The trapped star didn't just go supernova, it was induced into a hyper-accelerated collapse, triggering the antimatter payloads orbiting it. The explosion was not of light, but of pure, destructive gravity waves. It was a shaped charge on a stellar scale. The shadow entity recoiled. For the first time in eons, the predator felt pain. The darkness rippled and tore. A screech, not of sound, but of psychic agony, washed over the galaxy, felt by every sentient being. It was a warning. This prey bites back. The Alliance didn't stop. As the Harvesters reeled, the erased Ethelgard fleet, now retrofitted with human singularity weapons, decloaked from the void behind the enemy. They didn't fire lasers, they fired localized black holes. They tore chunks out of the shadow. It was the Ethelgard's ferocity guided by human intellect. The humans provided the scalpel, the Ethelgard provided the hammer. For weeks, the war raged on the rim. A silent, terrible struggle between the light of intelligence and the hunger of entropy. Finally, the shadows receded. They didn't die. You cannot kill the concept of hunger, but they realized the cost was too high. There were softer galaxies, quieter prey in the great dark. The massive shapes turned, rippling back into the intergalactic void, fading away like a nightmare at dawn. The stars they had blotted out returned, twinkling defiantly. In the aftermath, the rotunda was quiet, but it was a good quiet, the quiet of survival. Vok, old and humbled, watched from the gallery. Thyra stood at the podium. "We wanted to conquer the galaxy," she said to the mixed assembly of humans and aliens. "We wanted to be the masters of all we surveyed. We thought power was noise. We thought strength was violence." She looked at Solas, who was cleaning his glasses, looking like a tired university dean who had just pulled an all-nighter. "The humans showed us that true power is silence, true strength is restraint, and true victory is not standing over the corpse of your enemy, but standing beside a friend against the dark." The story ended not with a parade, but with a new project. The humans and Ethelgard began the construction of the Galactic Shield, a network of sensors and defenses that would span the entire Milky Way. They would be the Guardians. They would be the Silent Watchers. The Dominion was gone, erased by the very humans they sought to destroy. In its place stood something far stronger. Humanity was ready, yes. But now the galaxy was ready too. As Solas prepared to board his white ship to return to Earth, Thyra walked him to the airlock. "Will they come back?" she asked, looking out at the stars. Solas smiled, a small, sad smile. "Eventually, in 50,000 years, maybe 100, but by then we won't be hiding in the dark, Thyra. By then we'll be the ones holding the torch." He paused, looking at the bustling activity of the joint fleet. "You know, your fleet was quite impressive, loud but impressive." Thyra laughed, a clicking, chittering sound that felt light and free. "And your erasure was effective, annoying but effective." They shook hands, claw to skin. The human ship departed, vanishing into the fold of space without a sound. Thyra turned back to the work crews. "All right," she barked, channeling a bit of the old Warcast authority. "Let's get those sensors online. Keep it quiet, people. We have a galaxy to listen to." Camera pulled back, leaving the bustling shipyard, leaving the system, leaving the galaxy, drifting into the intergalactic void where the ancient monsters slept, dreaming of a meal that had bitten them back. The Milky Way spun, a spiral of light in the darkness, no longer a hunting ground but a fortress. A silent, deadly, waiting fortress. And in the center of it, on a small blue world, a child looked up at the sky and saw not a ceiling but a shield. Humanity was ready, and they always would be. The end of the story dissolved into a lingering shot of the stars, the eternal, unblinking eyes of the universe, and the profound, heavy silence that was no longer empty but full of promise. The final image was the emblem of the new alliance, a human hand clasping an Ethelgard claw, superimposed over a shield with a single word inscribed beneath in both languages: vigilance. But deep in the archives of the Terran Union, a single file remained classified, accessible only to the highest tier of leadership. It was a recording of the Harvester's retreat, a psychic imprint captured by the deepest sensors. It wasn't fear the entities had felt. It was recognition. They had encountered this species before in another galaxy eons ago, and they had lost then, too. Humanity wasn't just ready. Humanity was the ancient enemy the Harvesters had been running from all along. The humans had forgotten their own history, the cycles of their own exodus across the stars, but their instincts remained. They were the monster slayers, and now they were waking up.